tracing. So yeah, we talked about a year and a half ago or so, and Yassine Mescout was on that call too, and it was kind of a mott oriented group chat, I guess you could say, the offshoot of the Reddit forum
Yeah.
called. So yeah, so in that time or since that time, your profile has risen, and I wanted to touch on a couple of pieces that you've written over the last few months, mainly. Well, one is in fact a piece that you've written on Republican, the sort of Republican crisis of competency in the professional class, so that the sort of oh, there's Peter. Yeah,
Hey,
so
can you guys hear me?
those. Hey, Peter.
Oh, good. Sorry, my phone tried to join this call and like screwed up the connection of everything. So.
Oh, no problem. I really need to get past this Skype thing, but they make it easy to record, and I'm sure there are other alternatives. But yeah, some people get caught off guard by that. Not you, because I've been using this, but they're like, Skype? What the hell is this? 2011? What do you? But in any case, yeah. So tracing. This is Peter. He's located near me in Sacramento, and he's written for Aporia, Quillette, and some other outlets. He's got a Substack as well, and Peter's thing is kind of liberal, pro-tech, modernist, maybe even meta-modernist. That's something that he discussed recently on his YouTube channel. So yeah, bringing you two together seems like kind of a good fit. But tracing, just before Peter jumped on, I was discussing some of Tracy's recent work regarding two things primarily. His article on the problem of Republicans and professional class norms, professional class practices, and like just sort of general competency. They lack that. In other words, Republicans, there's a crisis of staffing in any kind of hypothetical conservative societal win, right? And so yeah, I wanted to touch on that, and then also tracing is written on effective altruism, long-termism, and that's something you also know about, Peter. But yeah, so tracing, which of those do you want to discuss first?
Yeah, I think we can jump into the Republican crisis of competency first, if you'd like.
Sure. So you want to kind of sum that up and then maybe extrapolate on that a bit?
Yeah, so the core of it, and the core thing to recognize, is that the Republican Party has been increasingly, and the political parties as a whole have been increasingly polarized by age and education. Now, people say, oh, young people always voted Democrat, urban people always voted Democrat. There's nothing different here. But if you look at the specific numbers, those trends have very much accelerated, and the party split has very much accelerated. More than that, young people who used to show this trend of becoming more conservative as they got older, you're not really seeing that with millennials. You're not seeing suddenly this like moment with millennials, particularly in the age of increasing secularization, as the Republican Party remains such a very Christian-focused party. It has, even though it has authentically around half of the voting population supporting it to one extent or another, that half of the voting population is drawn unfortunately from old people, from rural people, and from people outside of the professional class, that when it comes to any parts of the day-to-day of actually governing, and I'm using governing very liberally here, when it comes to law, when it comes to education, when it comes to anything and everything in the professional class, when it comes to filling of political appointments, the Republicans have a much, much shallower bench than the Democrats do. And they really, not only do they show no signs of reversing this, it looks like they don't even have an idea of how to begin going about reversing this. So the near-term future for this is already written, such that we can reasonably predict in the near-term future, in the mid-term future, the Republicans will have fewer and fewer options when it comes to actual technical elements of governance, such that increasingly they know exactly what they want someone to do, but there is nobody left to do it.
Do you have like an example of that, Trace, like a specific job or a task that Republicans are actually like on the ground unable to fill?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I look particularly at education in a lot of cases, and this is really, really visible in education. Right now, the big conservative movement in education is Moms for Liberty. And already the name of that tells you what you are dealing with. It is Moms for Liberty. It is not Teachers for Liberty. It is not Students for Liberty. It is Moms for Liberty. And the reason for that is because you will not find a lot of activated conservative enthusiast teachers. You will not find a lot of activated conservative enthusiast students. So what you have are these parents looking out, looking in from the outside on this system that they care about, but that they have no actual influence over, hoping to figure out how to wrest it closer to their preferences, even though they don't have administrators, they don't have teachers, they don't even have students. Nobody inside the system actually wants to really align with their preferences. So they're left, even when they can govern it, even when they can get on school boards, trying to enforce their will via top-down edicts that are resisted at every level by the educators and the administrators, and even the students who are actually in the system.
That's a fascinating example. And, I have such a hard time resonating with this topic because I've always lived in blue areas of the country and even like blue cities within blue states, right? So I'm trying to like put myself in the mindset of someone who's living in like an actual red state, like, I don't know, Missouri or something, but they live in a city, and everyone who does govern cities tends to be pretty liberal too. And all the people who like show up to their office jobs tend to be pretty liberal too, right? So like there is this weird thing where, and I've wondered this for a while, like what exactly are Republicans contributing to? Like, I know that sounds like insanely cynical, but like that's where my mind goes when you when you bring this up. Is like, what are they contributing to, and what's their project? Like, because I know the Democrats want to like secretly they want to get rich, secretly they want to like start cool companies and like live cool urban modern lives. What are other folks doing who like that's not their goal? Or am I maybe like seeing this wrong from their perspective?
Absolutely. So on a high level, this is going to be a generalization that does not apply to everyone. But as a generalization, what you can think about is conservatives work with things, liberals work with ideas. So what do conservatives do? You have truckers, you have farmers, you have police officers, which incidentally, it's not a coincidence that the police is the one branch of the government that liberals are perpetually fighting against right now, because it is one of the only governance areas that Republicans have an authentic foothold in. But you have those, you have small business owners, you have, these classic trades, salt of the earth types is what people will think of, that do authentically useful things, but authentically useful things not in the knowledge production domains, not in idea related domains. It's a profession or a polarization, profession by profession.
They've been attempting. I just going to chime in here. They've been attempting to turn the idea of working with things into kind of something dominant. Someone like Mike Rowe, that show Dirty Jobs, and then Joe the Plumber. These in a parallel universe, these are these are spokespeople for the hegemonic idea of working with things. But instead, we have a hegemony of the idea of ideas, and those folks are liberal/progressive. One example of the idea of things ruling rather than the idea of ideas. I know it's kind of a silly, strange dichotomy there, but would be Orban in Hungary saying something to the effect that we don't need a bunch of experts to figure out this problem. All we need are 10 strong young men to just go and do it.
Well, and that's almost fundamental to this divide, in that someone who is really good at plumbing is not necessarily going to be the same person who is thinking about the nuts and bolts of governance, who is thinking about the nuts and bolts of policy. So progressives fall into this also. Say you have John Fetterman, for example, where progressives look at him and they're like, finally, we found this salt-of-the-earth working class guy who really represents labor, this ideal that we really want, and finally we have this hardcore progressive candidate. Then he gets in office, and he is kind of just this liberal who supports Israel and doesn't really care about a lot of their causes and everything. And it's because like this Platonic ideal that they want doesn't really exist. This Platonic, neither for Republicans nor progressives, this Platonic salt of the earth worker who also happens to be hyper competent and also happens to align with them in all of their policy goals, that is not a real person. That is a fiction.
I feel like there's also this phenomenon. I think Richard Hanania had a big like tweet thread about this week, and he was talking about like the power of the Taylor Swift liberal. And this is the thing is like most people who are voting Democrat, they're not even paying attention to many of these things, and they, in my mind, just anecdotally, might even be plumbers and electricians, etc. But they're kind of like tuned out to a lot of things. But they're like the Taylor Swift liberal. They're just like normies who like watch football and also like vote for the hot girl sort of a thing. And like most people at some level aren't that complicated. But you know the confusing thing here is just kind of like where is that like weird overlap of the Democrat who is working like a blue collar job, and where is the Republican who's working the white collar job? And there's no sense of equal distribution in those groups. But like to have a more functioning society, maybe there should be. Is that kind of like a thought here?
Yeah, it's hard for me to know where to go with well-functioning society in this regard because I think we have established such a dysfunctional society and a dysfunctional society where we have polarized this idea production class versus this material class in many ways. And obviously, you need all parts of it to have a functional polis. There is one thing, building off of what you were saying about Taylor Swift Democrats, that really does stand out to me, though. And it's one of the most insightful things I ever heard about politics. Told to me through a sort of game of Chinese whispers via a friend who heard it via a friend of his who was a libertarian candidate for office. And the question that he asked his friend was basically, look, as a libertarian, obviously you're a representative of this minority political party. How on earth do you sway people towards you, or how would you sway people towards you? And the point that the candidate made was 80% of people are libertarians, more or less. 80% of people, the problem is, also conservatives are also liberals, are also progressives. 80% of people have fairly squishy, fairly low level politics where they can be persuaded to one degree or another by anyone who frames any idea in their values. This is overstating it to an extent. It's not exactly like that, but basically all of these parties and all of these ideas strike at certain universal or near universal ideas. And when you're so plugged in to the ins and outs of day-to-day politics, as I am, you forget how detached from it most people are. Like, my dad was talking to me the other day, and he was saying, hey, I just found this new online figure, this hot online figure who, you know, is coming up in some discussions and everything. Like, this guy, Ben Shapiro, you might like him. Take a look. Like, you know, it sounds so ludicrous to someone who's so plugged into politics, so plugged into the political fandom, that most people aren't thinking about these things most of the time, but they just aren't. And they really are amenable to big chunks of most sets of ideas. And where the Taylor Swift Democrats idea comes in is a lot of people will wind up going with, well, this feels normal, this feels sane, and they will kind of gravitate towards whoever gives a sense of security and a sense of sanity, which right now the Democrats are very much winning at.
Yeah, my aligned anecdote there is that my father-in-law, 3 years in the Trump presidency, he had never heard the name Mike Pence. And that just like blew my mind. And I just like laughed about that for like weeks on end when I found that out. I was like, oh my God, this is like amazing. But I think that he also like drives UPS and like he's just like a kind of absolutely by every metric a normie, like lives in the suburbs, that whole kind of thing. I was like, this is delightful. This is just amazing.
Yeah, well, my parents watched NBC Nightly News, and that's enough to have heard of Mike Pence at least.
See, my father-in-law just watches golf, so
maybe not at this point in history, but a few years ago. Yeah, the Republicans are they sort of represent the long tail of small business, and there's a lot of very kind of on the ground domain specific stuff going on with that sort of knowledge, but yeah, they seem sort of aloof and not exactly plugged into Fortune 500 business practices. And with the Fortune 500, or rather big tech specifically comprising so much of where the economy is going, I think that's another factor that's going to kind of keep Republicans on the outside looking in. But the Republican Party has celebrated the idea of small business and the small business person, and I think that's just increasingly out of step with the shape of the economy. It's dominated by by white collar mandarins who are just kind of peeling away from everyone else's sort of workplace experience, or at least as a business owner, what someone a franchisee in Montana might contend with every day. It's just they're just deviating from that. The trajectory of the professional class is just kind of wedded to Democrats and liberalism in a way that I think is only going to increase.
Yeah, and what I'll add to that is, again, sticking with education. I think, to an extent, even people don't realize the extent to which liberal assumptions and progressive norms are woven into the underlying fabric, not just of the people themselves, but the curricula they teach, the ideas they're thinking about, the ideas that are being talked about within their professions and so forth. So, like, you look at conservative attempts to establish curricula right now, and they're honestly really clunky and really pretty shoddy for the most part right now. So you look at what's happening in Florida with DeSantis, the curricula DeSantis is trying to implement, and they're trying to just sort of build things from the ground up. And the reason is that there really isn't, like, in a red state you'll have a conservative curriculum, and in a blue state you'll have a progressive curriculum. There's a little bit of that, but a lot more it's in a red state you'll have curriculum written by broadly progressive people, broadly liberal people, that maybe nods a little bit more to a few conservative ideas. And in a blue state, you'll have a curriculum written by progressives and liberals that doesn't really nod to conservative ideas. And in a really blue area, apparently, you'll have the new viral bit of news that's been going around right now, woke kindergarten, which is just, if you guys haven't seen it, this incredibly caricature level progressive, we're here on Turtle Island, the new name for America, talking about how settlers in settler colonialists in Palestine, occupied Palestine, need to be expelled, and just like this really any little comrades speaking to them, and there is.
I saw that Jordan Neely is part of the curriculum, apparently.
Yeah, and there just is sort of vaguely conservative equivalent to it, but it's very weak and very outside of the institutions.
I have not followed this too closely, but I mean, my vibe on it, just going by my political vibe compass, is that I feel like this is actually an area where conservatives could easily win and might win, just in the sense that I feel that people who are parents, all of a sudden, like I recently became a parent, you just start to freak out about things that seem wacky, like you just want to go to the doctor and you just want to know, like, just take this and you're fine. Like, you don't want any ideology or like anything at all. Like, all of a sudden, any like BS just becomes like ultra noxious, I think, to people who have young kids, in a way that, even like speaking as a liberal person, I feel totally comfortable saying that, right? And I think that conservatives could so easily win on anything regarding education if they just said, like, we're just returning to something, like we're not pivoting to something new and different and like scary and wacky in our own regard. We're just like returning to something that works, because some of these crazy liberal ideas are just too far out there. Like they jump the shark. It's just too much. Is there a? I mean, again, I'm just going on vibes here. Like, is that a thing that Republicans or conservatives are going for, or are they actually leaning more into like their own version of crazy wonderland?
So I would say 50-50. In that aspirationally, a lot of them will shoot for that sort of thing, and then at the same time, they can't seem to help themselves from going off into all sorts of different directions. But the key of it all, for me, is that they could, and sometimes do, win elections on that message. You know, you got Glenn Youngkin as governor of Virginia because people really do just like someone who feels normal and someone who doesn't seem threatening and doesn't seem like he's got his head in all sorts of crazy ideas and everything, and we'll just kind of return to normalcy and, say, strip gifted programs out of schools or things like that. And you can absolutely win elections on that message. But that's the only place they can win, and that's the only place they have people, is at the electoral level. They can muster candidates, and some of those candidates at the electoral level can be pretty decent candidates and can be pretty credible candidates, but they lack any sort of the framework that you need to extend what candidates can do. You know, even when you look at the political appointees, administration by administration, Republican presidential administrations appoint something like 30% Democrats to their positions, whereas Democrats appoint virtually no Republicans. And the core reason for all of this is that there just are not very many Republicans in any of these positions. And so anyone who is actually in a position of looking and saying, who can I appoint? Who can I get to do these things? Looks at it all and they're like, I just don't have Republican options, and I have to really scrape the bottom of the barrel to get any Republican options.
Is this why so many high-level Republicans are actually nuts? Like the Marjorie Taylor Greens? Like, it makes no sense to me why she's in Congress, for God's sakes. Is that why? Because there just aren't very many, and like the loudmouth wins?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a competency crisis. And you see this because you can see when a competent Republican arises. And it's pretty funny because usually like the really competent Republicans come from a pretty liberal background. So you have like Chris Rufo, who, I mean, he lives in the Seattle area, for heaven's sake, and he was like this, you know, libertarian, whatever, who ends up leaning into kind of the more mainstream conservative. And suddenly, because he's competent, everyone suddenly goes to him for everything because they're like, holy cow, finally we have someone who knows what he's doing. And suddenly he like skyrockets up in prominence. Or you have Aaron Siberian, who is in fact like a secular Jew liberal who just happens to be anti-woke. And so suddenly he becomes the number one conservative investigative reporter in the country because he happens to be competent and he happens to be willing to work on conservative things. They are desperate for competence.
Okay, my mind is just like now reeling with names. I'm thinking like Dave Rubin too falls into that bucket. I think you're right. There's like a ton of them.
Boy, David Rubin, he's off doing his own thing. It's sort of like when Glenn Beck left Fox and started becoming something, you know, kind of singular and proprietary. He kind of fell off the map. Something like that has happened with David Rubin.
Yeah, I think he just fell into conservative circles, like he's on the Blaze, I think, right?
Right.
Yeah, he was for a while at least. I don't keep up with what he's doing regularly.
Maybe we're all missing out.
But about the Democrats, far more of them come from a lawyerly background. And so, you know, they're the side of the political spectrum that is just more wordsmith oriented. And so I would imagine in a world increasingly made up of just watching people communicate, you know, not as opposed to just being, you know, rubbing shoulders with them as they help you figure out something very concrete directly in front of you at the local level. More and more is just, you know, watching people communicate through video and through audio. And so, you know, just if the side that is better at simply speaking and communicating is going to be, you know, perennially dominant, I think. So that salt of the earth thing actually kind of works against that. They may very well be salt of the earth, but, you know, they're going to put their foot in their mouth eventually, and that will be used against them. And so there's just something endemic to a communication-based rule that I think will constantly favor liberals and, you know, more specifically Democrats.
There is. And that reminds me, and I went ahead and put this in chat if you guys want to look at it. So Republicans sometimes will try and cite the Federalist Society as a counterexample to be like, we do have a lot of competence, we do have a lot of serious people, they're just all in law. So we've put this all in law and we have all of this. And that sounds really good until you look at the politics of top law firms and you realize even in law, even in these top firms, again, Federalist Society being very often cited as, no, here is where we have people. They don't. You look at the top law firms, very, very few are majority Republican in terms of campaign contributions. Vanishingly few. Vanishingly few have even more than a trivial amount of Republican campaign contributions. The great majority of the biggest and most powerful law firms in the country, liberal, progressive, down the line. And this happens in every one of these domains.
So how do we explain the fact that Republicans do still maintain so much power in society, and there's a pretty decent chance, I don't think he will, but a decent chance that Trump will win again? How do you explain that? Because here's the thing, like, Republicans are a minority party in this country, and I mean, it just seems by the numbers that they would almost never win almost anything, like outside of their state, like at the federal level. But they kind of do, like, to shockingly degrees. I don't know, like, what explains that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is simply that electoral politics is not the same as the day-to-day of the political machine. So people in the professional class and people in progressive areas and liberal areas feel like they are an overwhelming majority and feel like their ideas are what every decent person believes and their thoughts are what every decent person thinks, because that is the authentic experience in those areas. But despite the absence of Republicans in the professional class in general, with that age and education polarization, conservatives still exist, and conservatives still exist in very large numbers. And they are older, they are often less educated, they are generally more rural, and so they tend to be a lot less culturally visible, but they absolutely exist. And particularly with the way the political system is set up, to have two senators from each state, for example, and this is one of the things that obviously liberals push back on a lot now because they're like, this disfavors us now. But I mean, and look, everyone knew the rules of the game. They could have appealed more to rural people, and there's no inherent reason the two senators thing disfavors them. It's just the way it has shaken out right now. But anyway, based on the way the political system is set up, and based on their authentically large base of support, people cannot pretend that they don't have a large base of support. They do. They're able to win electoral politics. And the realities of a two-party system mean that both parties will be incentivized to remain competitive and to make whatever changes they need to remain competitive electorally. It just so happens that the changes Republicans have made to remain competitive electorally are not the changes that would let them actually govern.
Game over. Game over. Game over.